Hi, I'm Lucy. In this class, we're going to talk about how to give people feedback really well using a simple 4-point structure called the no drama feedback model. If you worry about giving people constructive feedback, or you find what you say is ineffective, this class is for you. How to give feedback properly is probably the most frequently discussed topics in coaching sessions with my clients. It comes up on a weekly basis because leaders worry about this all the time. Being able to give feedback really competently is one of the greatest tools you have to help develop people and create behavioral change. When you do it well, it deepens your relationships and helps you on your way to building a truly high-performing team. Before we jump into the how part, let's look at some research that helps us understand a bit more about what happens when we give someone feedback. Researchers by the name of Kluger and Danesi studied over 23,000 feedback interactions to determine how effective giving feedback really is. Among some other interesting findings, they discovered that 33% of the time, constructive feedback actually damages performance, which is a little worrying. Why does this happen? Wu et al. Carried out some research to help shed some light on this question. They used MRI scanning to look at what happens to different areas of the brain when we're given constructive feedback poorly. Now, before we go into their findings, let's have a quick brain anatomy lesson. This small almond-shaped area of the brain is called the amygdala. Among other complex things, the amygdala is involved in our fight, flight, or freeze response mechanisms when we get frightened or worried or anxious. Broadly, this area of the brain is called the prefrontal cortex. A subsection of this is involved in what we collectively call our executive functioning. It helps us think clearly, make logical arguments, make rational decisions. A lot of the things that really set us apart as humans. Now back to our researchers Wu et al. From their research, they found that when people were given constructive feedback poorly, their amygdala lit up on the scanner, showing their anxiety. We call that an upregulation. At the same time, their prefrontal cortex went dark on the scanner, and we call that a downregulation. Conversely, when the prefrontal cortex lit up, the amygdala went dark. This indicated an inhibitory loop mechanism between these two areas. Well, so what, I hear you say? Well, simply put, if we manage to trigger people's amygdala while we're giving them feedback, we shut down their ability to process what they're hearing. This means we are far less likely to have a constructive conversation with them, and we are more likely to hear a very defensive emotional response. This isn't going to lead to a reliable change in behavior, which could lend a reason to why Kluger and Danesi found that 33% of the time, feedback interventions actually damage performance. So how do we prepare for and deliver feedback in a way that has the least possible likelihood of triggering that amygdala in our team members? Well, firstly, we have to think a little differently about how we come across. What I find from my coaching sessions is that most of the time, people try to trade off being direct in their communication of the feedback with being kind. People feel this is this really tricky balance, this awkward tension between being kind and being extremely clear and direct with the message. Most of us can relate to that, right? My challenge to you is to stop thinking about that on one spectrum. It's actually on two completely separate spectrums, and it's perfectly possible to be kind and direct at the same time. Here's a model that we've used for years to explain this. It might remind you of Kim Scott's model. As I go through this, have a think about where you naturally find yourself when you deliver feedback. When we feel worried, we tend to make that trade-off and land in that top left box of being kind but indirect with our feedback. We want the other person to like us, and we feel a bit worried about hurting their feelings. So we make that trade, and by being indirect, often leave the person confused about exactly what needs changing. When we feel apathetic or a bit disinterested in giving this feedback, we often land in this bottom left box when we deliver it. It can come across as being a bit passive-aggressive too, when clearly there is something wrong, but we're not being very forthcoming with the specifics. When we feel frustrated or a bit irritated with the other person, we can easily slip below the line here and be direct but a bit unkind with our delivery. When we feel that emotion, we tend to make quite poor decisions about what to say. Obviously, whilst many of us can relate to delivering or being on the receiving end of such feedback, this is most likely going to lead to triggering that amygdala. Lastly, we have the ideal box, which is our upper right. When we feel confident with what we want to say, we have the best chance of being direct and kind at the same time, which leads to a higher likelihood of enabling the other person to receive and process the feedback in the best way, keeping that amygdala down-regulated and therefore allowing their prefrontal cortex to light up. That's all great, I hear you say. But how exactly do I feel more confident and land feedback that's both kind and direct? This is where our 4-point, no-drama feedback model comes in. This model is inspired by Marshall B. Rosenberg. I suggest you prepare and deliver your feedback using this structure, whether it's quick and in the moment, or the feedback is part of a larger, more difficult conversation. Think of someone that you need to give feedback to. They can be on your team, or maybe they're a peer, or even your manager. Keep them in mind as we go through this model. First, state what you've observed. What are the facts? What have you noticed happening? We want these to be objective as possible. For example, let's say your direct report has been really disengaged recently. You might say, I've noticed that in the last 4 team meetings, you've arrived at least 10 minutes after the start of the meeting. I've also noticed that you've not spoken in the last 2 meetings we've had. So there, I've not said they've been late or accused them of being disengaged. I've just stuck to the facts. Next, tell them how you feel about the facts. When you're using a feeling word, people tend to tune in to what you're saying better. So in our example, you might say, I feel a little worried about this, or I feel concerned to see this. Avoid using words like disappointed, as it's too parental. Stick to worried, concerned, confused, misunderstood, curious, hesitant, skeptical, that kind of thing. After that, share the wider impact or the wider implications. In our example, you might say, when you arrive 10 minutes late after the start of the meeting, it can send a message to the rest of the team that you're not interested, which affects their morale. It also makes me wonder whether you're feeling less motivated than you were before. Note it's important to be clear and direct about the impact the behavior has had. Lastly, ask a gentle question. So how are you feeling about things at the moment? Or, so what do you think about what I've just said? Or, how do you see things from your perspective? You are not asking a fix-it question here, which would sound like, so what are you going to do to fix this? Because we're trying to get to the bottom of what actually is going on. It's important to keep this question short and sweet to create some space for them to share what's going on. In structuring the feedback in this way, we're also making sure we have a conversation about the right thing. This is also the beauty of this model. What we often see in people's behavior are the surface symptoms of an underlying problem and not the actual problem. Think of an iceberg. In our example, the surface symptoms showed up in them arriving late, checking out of meetings, etc. But the reality is that disengagement could be about any number of things. We have to create an environment where we say what we see and give them the opportunity to share the source. So be curious. You will save so much time because solutions developed to address symptoms rarely work. You can also see that in expressing the feedback in this way, we're also being very direct but kind about how we present what we see. Let me run another example using the feedback model for you. I noticed that when you presented to the group yesterday, you tended to spend a lot of time looking down. I also noticed that you said a lot and picked at your thumbnails. I felt a little worried for you when I saw this because it makes you look a little unsure of yourself in front of the group, and it muddled the message you were trying to get across. How did it feel from your perspective? Here's another one. In the last 3 meetings we've had with the group, you've interrupted what I've been saying at least 2 times in each meeting. I feel bummed about this because it impacts my confidence and makes me look less credible in front of everybody. From your perspective, how do you see what I've just said? As a quick exercise now, think about the piece of feedback that you need to deliver to the person you thought of earlier. Take a moment now to write out the feedback for them using the no drama feedback model. Say it out loud and see how it feels. We've taught this model to hundreds and hundreds of people now, and people tell us that it's really been game-changing for them. Have a go at using it yourself. Good luck, and let us know how you get on.